What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my main channel, so if you're interested in what if Naruto had Madara and the Kyubi sealed inside of him, or what if Naruto was half Viltrumite and half Saiyan, go check out my main channel. And if you're interested in what if Naruto was a assassin in Westeros, or what if Naruto was the long lost heir to Whirlpool, go check out my third channel. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. Hokage's office. After dropping off Naruto, Jiraiya quickly began trying to convince the Hokage to allow him to reveal Naruto's parentage, at least to Naruto himself. So far the Hokage was holding firm in his refusal. Not until he's a Chunin, at least Sarutobi said. Once he knows he's going to have to assume a lot of responsibilities, and I'd prefer to hold off on that until he has a lot more experience under his belt. He can't claim any of his family's properties until then anyway, and we still haven't managed to undo that blood seal. He doesn't have to do any of that crap right away, Jiraiya countered. I just need to let him sign the Toad contract, and I can hardly have him try Namikaze without tipping him off as to who his father is. The Chunin exams are coming up soon anyway, and even I can tell he's already more than qualified. It'll be less than 2 months early. Sarutobi massaged his temples for a moment. Jiraiya needed to pass on the contract before he accepted the Toad's offer, and Naruto was both the best candidate and the most appropriate for a variety of reasons. He hadn't expected these sorts of problems, although given that it was Naruto he shouldn't be surprised. Nothing ever went exactly as planned where Naruto was concerned. How certain are you that his real name is the issue here? What else could it be? Have you tried asking the Toads directly? Well, no, why don't you do that then? Before we go any further, a quick summoning jutsu later, and the keeper of the contract had joined them in the Hokage's office. This Toad's sole duty was to maintain the true copy of the contract and oversee all ceremonies related to it. The scroll Jiraiya carried around was a copy that was linked to the true scroll kept in Myobokuzen. While the prospective summoner's true name is required in order to sign the contract, that is not the only problem in this case. The one known as Naruto Uzumaki is ineligible, the Toad replied flatly. What? Cried Sarutobi and Jiraiya. The one known as Naruto Uzumaki is ineligible, the Toad repeated. Why? Jiraiya demanded. You are both aware of the true purpose of the contract, correct? The Toad asked, getting terse nods, and replied, due to his condition we are unable to utilize Naruto Uzumaki's chakra in the necessary manner. It is quite likely that allowing him to sign the contract and perform the summoning jutsu will cause irreparable damage to the Toad tribe, the Toad explained. Because of the tailed beast's chakra? Sarutobi asked curiously. Essentially correct, the Toad replied. After a long moment, Jiraiya cursed. If Naruto would never be able to sign, then most of his plans for the apprenticeship were shot, not to mention that he now had to find another candidate to inherit the Toad contract. Sarutobi continued to probe the matter further. However, do you have any other objections to working with Naruto? For instance, if Jiraiya summoned one of you and asked you to assist Naruto in battle, would you be willing to do so? The Toad eyed Sarutobi for a long moment before answering carefully. As long as the request does not represent a danger to the Toad's life or the Toad tribe as a whole, we are bound by the terms of the contract to fulfill any request made of us. It is up to the individual Toad's discretion should they choose to go above and beyond the terms of the contract, as Gamabunta-sama did in battling the nine-tailed beast. Sarutobi frowned thoughtfully, noting that the Toad had not directly answered the question. I see, he said, and turned back to Jiraiya. I have no further questions at the moment, do you, Jiraiya? When Jiraiya replied in the negative, they thanked the Toad for his time and allowed him to return to Myobokuzen. Though Naruto will not be able to sign the contract, I assume you will still be teaching him the Rasengan? Sarutobi asked. After a moment, Jiraiya signed and nodded. Yeah, he also seemed really excited to learn seals from me, though I hadn't really given that any thought until now. Sarutobi chuckled. Yes, I should have known Naruto has devoured sealing knowledge even more quickly than he did medical training, and has submitted requests at least once a week for more advanced sealing instruction. He has already exhausted all the knowledge the other practitioners in Konoha possess, it seems. Oh, I hadn't paid that much attention to his progress. Has he really gotten that far? I'm no expert, but he already knows more than I do. He's been very conscientious about not experimenting above what is allowed, but he probably has a solid grasp on the theory of just about every seal Konoha knows. B rank and below. That's pretty impressive. I'll have to test him myself, but that should serve as an excellent base for what I can teach him. That still leaves the problem of the Toad contract. However, you may not be able to have Naruto himself sign, but have you considered one of his friends or teammates? All of them are quite promising, and their close association would still allow Naruto to interact with the Toads on a regular basis. I'll think about It knowing you already have someone in mind though don't you? Sarutobi just chuckled. That I do, but I won't try to influence you as a fellow contract holder. I understand just how important that relationship is. It should be your decision, not mine. Time skip Konoha training grounds. Sorry brat, but looks like you won't be able to sign the contract after all, thanks to the beast stuck in your gut, Jiraiya said apologetically. I can't sign the contract because I'm a Jinchuriki, Naruto asked quietly. Sounding subdued. That's what they told me. That's unfortunate. I was really looking forward to summoning the toads. Yeah, I'm rather bummed about it myself, but I still have plenty of other stuff I can teach you. I've gotten an update on your sealing knowledge and we'll figure out where we can start there. But first, Jiraiya said, holding up his hand with the palm facing upwards. A ball of swirling blue chakra appeared in his hand. This is one of the fourth Hokage's personal techniques, the Rasengan or spiraling sphere. Time skip Sunagakure. We're supposed to do what Temari shouted at their Jounin sensei. Baki Kazakage-sama was very clear during the exams. You are to kill any Konoha genin you can, preferably without allowing the matter to be traced back to you. Failing that, allow Gaara to make the kills. What the hell is he thinking? There is no way we could possibly get away with that. Has he not heard what they did to that guy from Kumo? Baki blanched. Everyone had heard about what happened to Kaido Miyazaki. That incident may have strained relations between Konoha and Kumo, but it also bolstered Konoha's reputation as a village to be feared. Still, he was a Jounin of Suna, and his Kage had given him orders. It is not our place to question Kazakage-sama's plans. Our time would be better spent focusing on how to accomplish this task without getting caught. The requirements for the exam state that at least one test must pit the teams against each other in a battle royale of sorts, usually with both an offensive and defensive objective. Killing is still discouraged, but it does happen and is within the rules. Even if we did get caught, they would be unable to do anything officially. I'm sure that Kumo guy thought the same thing. Temari snapped bitterly. Kankuro winced but started off the discussion. I have a variety of poisons I could employ if I use the more generic types. There's no way they could prove it was us. Some of them may have acquired resistance to those poisons, but certainly not all of them. Baki nodded gratefully at Kankuro. Good, that will help tremendously. What about you, Tem? I'll just crush them all, Gaara said blandly, not even bothering to turn his head away from the window to look at the group. Baki looked like he wanted to object, but kept his mouth shut. He'd had a couple of close calls in the past and knew that whatever protection Gaara afforded his siblings did not extend to him. He turned a pleading eye to Temari. Temari moved over to stand next to Gaara, her hand lifted hesitantly as if to grasp his shoulder, but the sand around Gaara's feet twitched and she swiftly withdrew it. Gaara, you have to be very careful about who you kill, and when if the Konoha nin catch you, they won't just let you go. Temari pleaded. Yeah man, Kankuro added, you'll have to wait until that battle royale thing starts. They won't be able to stop me, Gaara said dismissively. Gaara, please listen to me, it won't be like it is here. They won't just let it drop. If you do kill the wrong person or kill someone at the wrong time, they'll try to arrest you or even kill you. Temari said. Her brother finally turned away from the window to look at Temari. His eyes had widened slightly and he had a manic grin on his face. Do you think they could? He asked. Temari actually felt her heart stop beating for a long moment. His voice was filled with energy and he sounded eager. He was excited at the thought that someone could kill him. She just shook her head in denial, unable to force any words past the lump that had formed in her throat. Kankuro and Baki both had stunned expressions on their faces. Gaara's grin slowly faded as he misinterpreted Temari's reaction. I guess not, he said quietly. He turned and began walking away. Temari just watched him leave, still paralyzed by what she had just heard. She couldn't have heard that right. She refused to believe that. Time skip Amigakure. You three are to take your genin teams to the exams in Konoha. They have earned the right to represent AIM for this exam, and I am sure they will do our village proud. Thank you, Commander. However, while you are there, you and your teams will have a secondary mission. In this bag you will find 3 stones. Distribute them to your teams and make sure they keep the stones with them at all times as you move about the village. They are to note when and where they vibrate and who is in the area at the time. When you return, I will expect a comprehensive report on their findings. Understood, Commander. If I may ask, what will the stones be? Reacting to it is better if you do not know at this time. Rest assured that you will be in no danger because of the stones or what they react to. Simply consider this a somewhat unusual scouting mission. Very well, Commander, and make sure they do not let the stones out of their possession. They are quite difficult to make and I will be most displeased if one is lost. Understood, Commander. Time skip. At Shiraku's ramen stand, Ino watched as Naruto continued to rapidly consume yet another bowl of ramen. Ever since the first time they had eaten here on the day of the team assignments, Naruto had insisted on coming back as often as possible. Fortunately, Hinata had helped her persuade Naruto to limit their visits to twice a week as a team, though Ino had the feeling that Naruto visited much more often on his own. Ino had also noticed that the bar had a lot of new fixtures and that Tucci seemed to have a permanent grin whenever Naruto was in sight. Say, Ichiraku-san, Ino called out to the stand owner, you seem to be buying a lot of new equipment. I think everything in The stand has been replaced, Ino observed. Tochi just nodded eagerly. Naruto-sama's patronage has proven to be a great boon to my business. Once word spread that he liked the food here, we have had more customers than we can handle. The Akimichi approached me about working in one of their restaurants, but with Naruto-sama's help I was able to convince them to loan me enough funds to open a full-sized restaurant. Seriously? Ino asked, turning to look at Naruto with a raised eyebrow. He didn't even dignify her question with a response, instead slurping the broth out of the bowl loudly. Tochi nodded rapidly, his grin growing even wider. The grand opening is next week. Ayam-chan is actually over there right now making sure everything is set up. Ino just shook her head, deciding not to think about why Naruto would spend that much time and effort securing his source of ramen. She was about to ask for a refill on her water when Naruto's head whipped up, and he dropped the bowl of ramen he had been eating. Naruto? Ino asked, not liking the stunned expression on his face. Tochi also appeared concerned, asking if something was wrong with the ramen, but Naruto just waved him off and darted out of the stand. Ino gaped at him and stood to chase after him before realizing that they had yet to pay. She turned to look at Tochi reaching for her wallet, but he just waved her off with a concerned expression. Don't worry about it, he told her. I know Naruto-sama will return, just make sure he's alright, Ino shouted her. Thanks behind her as she ran after Naruto. He seemed to be running full tilt towards the western gate. Time skip. Konoha's western gate. Temari shifted nervously as the gate guards reviewed their travel papers. The other teams from Suna had already arrived, none of them willing to travel together with her team, or more specifically Gaara. She hated it, but was forced to admit they had probably been wise to do so. Gaara had started acting odd. Well, odd for Gaara. As they approached Konoha, she was worried that he was going to start lashing out at anyone nearby, and that he would end up killing someone before they even entered the city. The sooner they had secured their hotel room and she had a chance to talk to him, the better. She noticed a small disturbance beyond the gates, but couldn't make it out at this distance. Her attention was diverted to Gaara, who suddenly staggered and fell to his knees. It stopped, he said, his voice soft. He sat back on his heels and raised a trembling hand to his temple. It stopped. Temari gulped nervously as she noticed that everyone in the area was staring at Gaara. Time to run. Damage control fast. As she began, her voice trembling slightly. Gaara, I'm glad your headache is gone, but there's no need to be so dramatic about it. Why don't we go to our hotel and you can relax? She wanted to say something more, but she was interrupted. A young teenager skidded to a halt near Gaara. His blue eyes and Temari did a double take because his eyes had slits for pupils focused solely on Gaara. The boy's hair was a bright blonde, and he wore loose black pants along with a tight black shirt that showed off his well-muscled frame. He had a few pouches strapped to his body and a Konoha headband tied around his forehead. He also had 6 lines across his face, some sort of tattoo or clan marking, perhaps an Inuzuka. Maybe she had heard that they had animalistic qualities and tattoos on their cheeks. Gaara raised his head to look at the newcomer and stumbled to his feet. He moved towards the boy and stretched out his hands, grabbing hold of the boy's shirt. It's you, he said, his voice slowly growing louder. You made it stop. How? Tell me how. The boy's expression was odd, shifting between elation and confusion. Made what stop? He asked after a moment. The screaming. You made the screaming stop. Tell me. No. Gaara suddenly shouted, his hands releasing the boy and clutching at his temples. No, stop. I don't understand the screaming. The boy growled. Temari shuddered. It must have been her imagination, but she would have sworn his voice changed, becoming far deeper and rumbling in a way that no human voice should ever be capable of. Gaara didn't appear to hear the question. Stop. What is Kushu? I don't understand. Just stop. Gaara threw his head back and let out a loud scream filled with rage and frustration and grief and a dozen other emotions all at once. He then disappeared, sand slowly swirling and settling to the ground where he had stood a moment ago. In the stunned silence that followed, a girl ran up to them, panting lightly as she stopped next to the boy. Naruto, what the hell is going on? She asked. The boy, Naruto, apparently slowly turned to face the girl, his face frozen into an expressionless mask. We need to talk, he said, and grabbed the girl before disappearing in his own shunshin. Temari just stared in bewilderment before she felt a hand settle firmly on her shoulder. She looked up and paled as she saw the animal mask of one of Konoha's ANBU. 2 more were standing next to Kankuro and Baki, and a 4th appeared to be talking to the gate guards. Please come with us, the ANBU said in that creepy distorted voice. She looked at Baki, but he just nodded, a resigned expression on his face. Time skip. Konoha training grounds. What the hell is going on? Ino said again as she recovered from the unexpected shunshin. The sudden acceleration was a little tough on her stomach when she wasn't braced for it, not to mention that Naruto's shunshin was faster and much more abrupt than Her own, why was that guy yelling like that? That guy was the Jinchuriki from my brother Ryuto. Naruto said, his voice tense and his fists clenched. He was pacing around the clearing and Ino could see small tendrils of his yuki curling off his body. Not good then, he was really pissed if he was losing control like that. That's the one tail, right? Ino said, recalling what Naruto had told her of his family. Yes, Naruto replied tersely. Well, that's good then, right? You finally found one of them, so why are you so angry? Because his container said that I had stopped the screaming. Naruto growled, what screaming? I didn't hear any. Oh fuck yes, fuck. He didn't say yelling or shouting or cursing, he said screaming. Whatever that seal is doing to my brother, he's in a lot of pain and has been for the last 100 years. He turned and lashed out at a nearby tree, a claw forming out of yuki and smashing into it. Several more trees suffered the same fate, before Naruto finally relented, standing in the middle of the clearing and panting. Ino shuddered at that thought. She couldn't even imagine what it would take to make a Bija feel pain, much less enough pain to make them scream. Well then we just have to fix it, Ino said firmly. Naruto turned to stare at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Right, yes, we can fix it. I don't know enough to work with seals of that level yet though, he said quietly. His eyes widened and he smiled grimly. But Jiraiya does. He turned and looked as if he was about to charge out of the clearing that very moment, but Ino shouted at him before he could leave, wait, you can't just go charging him like that. That whole scene with the Jinchuriki kid had to have set off all kinds of alarms, and if you go charging in on the Hokage or Jiraiya and demand that they fix the seal, it's not going to go well, not to mention that you're still leaking yuki. Naruto glanced down. Sure enough, small tendrils of red energy were still curling off of his body. Naruto growled, but stayed in the clearing. What would you suggest then? Time skip forest outside of Konoha. 2 squads of ANBU were keeping watch on Gaara as he rampaged through the forests outside of Konoha using sand he had acquired from somewhere. There was far more being flung about at the moment that he could possibly hold, and that gore on his back to smash trees or rip them from the earth and throw them about his ranting had devolved into incoherent screams and shouts. Jiraiya soon arrived and calmly observed the swath of destruction Gaara had left in his wake. He had a sheet of paper and a brush in his hand, and he was slowly crafting a seal as he watched. Anything to report? Jiraiya asked. Bear, all he's been doing is ripping up trees and shouting. We haven't been able to make out anything of importance, the ANBU replied. After a moment of hesitation, Bear asked, this as soon as Jinchuriki, isn't it? I've heard reports about the sand usage from the Second and Third Wars. Looks like it, Jiraiya replied, focusing on a particularly tricky section of the seal he was crafting. Naruto could have turned out like that, couldn't he? Jiraiya's head snapped up and he looked at the ANBU for a long moment. Possibly, yeah, if we had used a different seal, if we had treated him differently, yeah, he could have thanked Kami for you and Yondaime-sama. Then Bear said fervently, so how are you going to stop him? A combination chakra suppressing seal and sleep seal won't suppressing his chakra kill him. I saw the medical reports on Naruto. A normal one could maybe, hard to say how similar his condition is to Naruto's, but this ain't a normal chakra suppressing seal, not by a long shot. Watch and learn, kiddo. Jiraiya finished the seal with a flourish, then put away the brush. He tucked the paper with the seal into his sleeve and observed Gaara's progress for a few moments. His hands formed 2 quick hand signs before he leaned backwards and fell off the branch he had been standing on. He fell headfirst with one hand stretched out. Earth release, swamp of the underworld, he shouted, intentionally drawing Gaara's attention. His leading hand made contact with the ground and sank straight into it, the rest of his body following until he had completely submerged. From the point of impact, the ground began turning a dark murky brown. The technique's effect reached Gaara's position within moments and he stumbled to his knees with a splash as the ground beneath him suddenly turned into muck. Gaara wanted to lash out, but the strange white-haired man had disappeared immediately after using this technique. His sand was also getting heavier, weighed down by the water he was in. He cast about for another target, but was suddenly hit from behind by a heavy stream of water that stripped the sand armor from his body and further weighed down his sand. He whipped around as quickly as he could, pulling the small bits of sand that remained dry into a spear to attack with, but a sheet of paper suddenly blocked his vision. He felt a hand pressing against his forehead and a surge of chakra, then nothing. Jiraiya smirked to himself as Gaara crumpled at his feet. A quick scan confirmed that the seal was working as intended and that his organs were still functioning properly. Damn, I'm good, he said smugly. He picked up the Jinchuriki and threw him over his shoulder, then began tree-hopping back to Konoha. Time skip ANBU prison. Baki, Temari and Kankuro were currently sitting on one side of a small table shoved together uncomfortably, and 3 chairs in ANBU stood in each corner of the room watching them with those expressionless masks. None of them had said a word since They entered the room. Tamari knew it was an intimidation tactic, but she also knew it was working. The three of them had been escorted politely to this room where they had waited for nearly an hour before a man with a heavily scarred face had entered the room. He had smiled politely and asked them politely what had happened to their teammate at the gates and what could have triggered such a response. Baki had handled all the questions so far, signaling his genin to keep their mouths shut. Kankuro and Tamari had no trouble complying with that request. The Konoha ninja had so far not even laid a hand on them, but all of them couldn't help but think of Gaara's murderous tendencies and the mission the Kazekage had given them. The scarred man had left after 30 minutes and the ninja from Suna had been left to wait, uncomfortable, hungry and thirsty, with the ANBU still staring at them silently. Tamari shuddered slightly. It was definitely working. The door opened again and Tamari felt the blood drain from her face as two men she recognized very well entered the room. The taller and younger of the pair had a large mane of white hair and very distinctive red lines starting under his eyes and running all the way down his face. Jiraiya of the Sannin, the older of the pair, wore a simple white robe and matching hat with the symbol for fire written in large bold strokes upon the hat. Hiruzen Sarutobi, Hokage of Konoha, and the god of shinobi. She had heard that the Hokage liked to project a kind grandfatherly image, but she saw no evidence of that here. His face was a grim stone mask and he moved with purposeful strides as he swept into the room and stood across the table from them, his eyes sharp and piercing. Sakamoto Jounin, I would like to thank you for your cooperation in this matter. The Hokage began, his tone even. Technically speaking, your team has not committed any crime, and you could have easily demanded to be released immediately. Thank you, Hokage-sama. I understand how this situation must look, and in light of Suna's alliance with Konoha, I am willing to endure this small inconvenience for the sake of continued good relations. Baki replied smoothly. Baki was one of Suna's most experienced jounin, but ultimately he had been selected to lead the team which held all three of the Kazekage's children because of his political acumen and diplomatic cunning. Indeed, the Hokage said slowly, drawing out the word, in light of our alliance, I would ask that you explain something for me. When the Kazekage informed me that you and your team would be attending the exams, he also assured me that despite any reports we might have heard to the contrary, Gaara had overcome the problems caused by his status as the Jinchuriki of the one-tailed beast and was quite stable, almost docile. The Hokage said, his tone still even and calm. Baki gulped quietly. They were finally getting to the heart of the matter. Why then did Gaara have what appears to have been, for all intents and purposes, a psychotic break before he even managed to step through the gates of my village? I do not know, Hokage-sama. I have observed Gaara for many years now and have never known him to act in this manner. He seemed to fixate on that young genin. However, may I ask who that was? It is possible there is something unique to him that caused this reaction, Baki replied, doing his best to sound calm and reasonable. It was much harder when the Hokage's eyes narrowed even further when he asked about the young boy. Instead of answering, the Hokage turned to look at Jiraiya. The Toad Sage stepped forward and began asking his own questions. Who designed the seal holding back the one-tailed beast? He asked. Baki blinked, surprised at the question. He considered his reply carefully but finally decided that there was no risk in answering. My understanding is that it is the same seal used since Suna first captured the one-tailed beast. Chiyo-sama was and is Suna's best sealing expert, and applied the seal herself. Jiraiya sighed quietly. Did anyone verify that the seal was applied properly? Did anyone actually examine the seal design? Kazekage-sama himself examined and approved the seal. Baki said, did he request any special changes be made to the seal? Jiraiya pressed. Baki slowly sat back in his chair, considering Jiraiya carefully. He knew Jiraiya was a seal master, one of the few in all of the elemental nations. Baki himself only knew enough about seals to craft the common storage seal and exploding tags, but he didn't feel comfortable answering any more questions. Just because he didn't see the significance doesn't mean that Jiraiya couldn't pull something of value out of seemingly innocuous information. He had only said as much as he had because it was common knowledge as far as Suna was concerned. May I ask why you are so interested in the seal? Baki finally asked. Jiraiya shook his head in disgust, because whoever wrote that seal on Gaara is either grossly incompetent and damn lucky, or wasn't particularly interested in the Jinchuriki's well-being. What? Tamari cried out, jumping to her feet and slamming her hands on the table. She gulped and quickly sat back down when everyone in the room turned to focus on her. Baki quickly spoke up, diverting the attention in the room back to himself. Am I to understand that you have managed to locate Gaara and that he allowed you to examine his seal? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Allowed is such a strong word. I just snuck a quick peek while he was napping, Jiraiya said. Offhandedly, all three Suna ninjas surged to their feet shouting in outrage, "What have you done to my brother?" Temari cried. "If you hurt him I swear to Kami I'll started Kankuro Hokage-sama, I must protest this violation of Baki began." "Shut up," yelled Jiraiya, his voice ringing loudly within the confined space. "What the hell is wrong with you people? He's asleep. I haven't done anything to him," he explained. "That's bullshit," shouted Temari, more concerned about Gaara's safety than her own at this point. "If you killed him I'll." Jiraiya's eyes narrowed as he turned to focus on Temari. "Easy there, little lady, why is that bullshit?" Baki pushed Temari and Kankuro back into their seats and answered in their stead, "Gaara-sama can't be asleep. He has never once slept since he was sealed." Both Jiraiya and the Hokage stared at Baki, and even the ANBU shifted slightly in their positions. "Never," repeated Jiraiya slowly. "You're trying to tell me that little shrimp has been awake from the moment he had the tailed beast stuck in him?" Baki just nodded solemnly. "As I'm sure you've heard, he complained of the screaming during his episode earlier. He says that he has heard that screaming nearly every moment of his life and it keeps him awake. No one has ever been able to get a calming or sleeping jutsu to stick on him either. Whenever such a jutsu is applied his sand lashes out indiscriminately and he wakes within a matter of minutes anyway." The Hokage glanced sharply at Jiraiya, but the seal master just waved him off. "Well, he's getting a long overdue rest right now then," he said. Temari stared at him for a long moment, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Really? He's really asleep? He's okay?" she asked in a trembling voice. Jiraiya grinned and gave her a thumbs up. "As if I would ever lie to a lady." Temari just sniffled, quickly wiping the tears away from her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "Thank you." Jiraiya coughed uncomfortably and turned back to Baki. "Now that we've got that cleared up, back to what I was saying earlier. That's either the shittiest seal that still managed to function or the most malicious seal I've ever laid eyes on, and if you guys knew it was that bad for him and the Kazekage hasn't tried to have it changed or improved, I'm going with the latter." Baki shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer the implied question. Instead he asked, "May I ask what about the seal would lead you to that conclusion?" Jiraiya whipped out a sheet of paper and drew a circle, then divided the circle into 4 equal parts. "Let's say this is your standard seal," he said, motioning to the paper. The other people in the room, even the Hokage, turned to pay attention to him. Despite the circumstances, a sealing master was about to hold forth on his area of expertise. This was a priceless opportunity for the ninja in the room. Jiraiya smirked slightly as he caught the hand signals the ANBU sent each other, the two behind him complaining that they couldn't see the paper properly and demanding that the others prepare to reproduce the images later. He always loved working with an appreciative audience and so made sure to turn the paper back and forth to allow everyone in the room a clear view. He labeled each slice of the circle with a number 1 through 4. Even the simplest of seals will have multiple parts and they each have to be balanced against each other so that the overall seal works out properly. If this was a storage scroll, for instance, section 2 here would be a chakra vent that dumped excess chakra out as wasted energy, making sure that the array doesn't get overpowered should that happen, he said, writing a large X across section 2 and channeling chakra into the paper. The paper began to smolder and then caught fire and was completely consumed in a matter of seconds. Poof! Jiraiya pulled out another sheet of paper and drew another circle, once more dividing it into 4 parts. He then drew a series of smaller circles within the original one, the lines growing finer and finer until they were barely visible. "Now we have a much more complicated seal, but the basic principles still apply. There's a lot more parts, but it still has to balance with Gaara's seal." He trailed off, eyeing the paper critically for a moment. He laid the paper flat on the table and moved his brush rapidly, adding new lines or large blots of ink at random. Some of the lines actually went outside the circle or looped back into themselves. The original design was completely obliterated by the time he was done. "First, somebody fucked the whole thing up so bad there was no possible way to balance it cleanly." He continued, picking up the paper. He turned it this way and that, then pulled out a kunai and shredded the whole thing. He gathered up the pieces and began slapping them on the table. After a few seconds he had a roughly circular shape, but the lines didn't match up properly anywhere. He took his kunai and cut around the edge of the paper, trimming off bits here and there until the whole thing was perfectly circular again. Then, rather than starting fresh, they just smashed it all together until they got something that kinda sorta looked like it might work if you were a blind idiot. "But it does contain the tailed beast, so surely it can't be that bad," Baki pointed out. "You're right, which is why I have to go with malicious. It probably took even longer to get this pile of shit functioning than it would have to start with a brand new seal, but there's one particular benefit to this approach that a clean seal wouldn't get you. Gaara has absolutely horrendous chakra control, doesn't he?" All 3 of the Suna ninja looked ill and nodded silently. "Thought so. His own chakra feeds into the seal just as much as the tailed beasts does, and the seal just smashes them together at random, filters the chakra, pulls it apart, compresses it, stretches it, and so on. I couldn't tell you exactly what the screaming was, but if the tailed beasts really are just pure chakra and had to go through that, it wouldn't surprise me at all if it was pure torture for the one-tailed beast. Baki swallowed thickly as he processed this new information. How is that a benefit? Though the Hokage answered this one calm. Now Sakamoto Jounin, I know you can't be that naive. Suna has always used their Jinchuriki as a weapon, but they have also always mistreated them and given the Jinchuriki no reason to love Suna or to feel loyal to it. As such, it would behoove the village to make sure their weapon requires their support in battle if he is to be effective, and thus limit the techniques he can use to only those granted by his status as a Jinchuriki. Can you help him? Temari asked in a quiet voice. Once again all eyes in the room turned towards her, but her gaze remained focused on Jiraiya. Maybe, he replied, his voice low, but interfering with an active shinobi to that extent would definitely violate the terms of our alliance with Suna. Fuck Suna, Temari snapped. Baki's head whipped around to look at her, but she faced his gaze with a fierce expression. Everyone in Suna hates Gaara, and by extension us. Even you have had a lot of trouble ever since you became our teacher, and now we find out that the Kazekage did this to Gaara on purpose. Fuck him, Temari snarled. The Hokage watched their interaction with interest, but added his own opinion to the conversation. As strongly as you feel about the matter, Suna is our ally, and that would still be a betrayal. Kankuro cleared his throat loudly. About that, he said quietly. He looked at Baki and Temari with a raised eyebrow. Temari understood what he was asking quickly and nodded in reply. Baki stared at Kankuro for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair with a pensive expression on his face. If he went through with this, there would be no going back. That in mind, he considered the most likely outcome if he stopped Kankuro and Temari at this point. First there was Gaara to consider. There was no predicting what he would do or say, especially if Konoha offered to fix his seal in exchange for information or his loyalty. Regardless of what the Hokage claimed, Baki was certain that Konoha would be more than willing to betray Suna, or at least bend the terms of the alliance if there was something of sufficient value at stake. Konoha was the strongest of the 5 great villages and Suna the weakest. Suna actually brought very little to the alliance, merely serving as a deterrent should Iwa seek to start another war. Then there was the likelihood that Kankuro and Temari would disobey him for Gaara's sake and inform Konoha of the nature of their mission anyway. His time as their Jounin instructor had made it very clear that their loyalty was to each other far more than to their father or the village, and he couldn't really blame them for feeling that way. He wondered if the Kazekage realized just how badly he had alienated his own children, and if he would even care if he did. Regardless, if they informed Konoha against his orders, he would be done for. Konoha would pull a Miyazaki on him or send him back to Suna to face the Kazekage's wrath for failing the mission so thoroughly, and managing to lose all 3 of his children to Konoha. He wasn't entirely certain which he would prefer if he did go along with this and tell Konoha what would be their likely reaction. Mistrust. Obviously this could just as easily be a plot to plant spies within Konoha or to discredit them in the international arena by making them betray the terms of the alliance. Baki had no doubt that the Kazekage would deny all knowledge of issuing such a mission, especially since it had all been handled as a black op. There was no record anywhere that could possibly provide evidence for this. Still, Konoha had the Yamanaka clan, who could supposedly read minds, and he could provide evidence that way, which would also reveal that he had intended to go along with it. That could go either way. Ninja were expected to follow orders even if they didn't personally agree with them, but he had also plotted to kill several genin from prominent clans within Konoha. Miyazaki's fate had made it very clear how Konoha would respond to such a threat, though the fact that he had no intention of acting personally might protect him there. He was a loyal Suna ninja, though had been for over 30 years. He had started a family there, though his wife had died several years ago and his only son fallen in the line of duty a year before that. He had sacrificed much for his home and didn't intend to betray it now, even if the Kazekage seemed bound and determined to provoke Konoha into attacking them. He frowned as he thought about that, as he had many times since he first received his orders. Why would the Kazekage order them to attack their ally like this? Suna desperately needed more missions after the Wind Daimyo cut their funding and began using his personal samurai forces to handle the missions traditionally reserved for ninja, but weakening their only ally in such a manner seemed a very poor way to attract attention, and if Kami forbid Konoha decided to go to war over this incident, Suna would be crushed completely and utterly. Perhaps there was a way to help his charges, and Sunagakure At the same time, he couldn't personally think of a way to turn the situation in that direction, but if he could convince the Hokage of his sincerity, perhaps he wouldn't have to think it through on his own. It seemed the only path that allowed him to survive the day intact and preserve his loyalty to Suna. At the same time, he sighed and finally looked up. Before we continue, I would like a guarantee of asylum for myself and my charges, and a solemn vow from Jiraiya that he will do everything in his power to help Gaara. If you can do that, you will have my full cooperation. And mine, echoed Kankuro and Temari as the Hokage's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Baki closed his eyes and sent a silent prayer to whatever deity cared to listen. He was committed to his course now. He just hoped he had made the right choice. Time skip Hokage's office. The Hokage will see you now, Naruto-kun, Mitsuko said, smiling at him. Thanks, Mitsuko-san. Kushu replied. Before he stepped into the office, he saw the Hokage was busy working through a surprisingly large pile of paperwork and seemed relieved at the interruption. Naruto-kun, it's good to see you again. I was actually hoping to talk to you soon. I understand that you were involved in that bit of drama at the gate earlier today. I was Hokage-san, and I wanted to talk to you about that as well. Well, why don't you go first, then we can get to my questions later. Well, who was that kid? I sensed something really strange while I was eating lunch and rushed over to see what it was, and that kid was the source. I think he sensed something too, since he claimed that I had done something. The Hokage sighed. That was Asuna Genin, who had a very troubled past. That doesn't explain what was so different about him. I've never felt anything like that before. Normally this would be considered a secret, but given the nature of it, I will tell you. I ask only that you don't spread it around too much, the Hokage said quietly. When he received a nod in reply, he continued, that boy was Gaara of the desert, the Jinchuriki of the one-tailed beast. Kushu forced his face to pale, remembering the plan he and Ino had come up with. The Hokage had already given him a better lead and that he had expected to have. When you say troubled past, the Hokage grimaced. Suna is not as understanding about his condition as Konoha has been about yours. There also seem to be some psychological effects from the seal as well, which have complicated the matter. Kushu frowned. You mean they hate him and drove him insane? He said, his voice harsh. Another sigh. This one tired. That does seem to be the case. That could have been me, couldn't it? Kushu said, making his voice soft, almost fearful. No, even if Konoha were so stupid as to blame you for the actions of what you contain, I would never have allowed something like that to happen. The Hokage replied immediately, his voice firm. Kushu allowed his expression to relax, looking at the Hokage gratefully. It was all too easy to manipulate the Hokage like this. It didn't work for more mundane matters, but whenever the topics of his burden or his family came up, the Hokage would quickly fold, seeming almost desperate to appease him. He made sure not to abuse that fact too often, but it had proven very useful over the years. Can we help him? Kushu asked. Surely there's something we can do to protect him. It's interesting that you should ask that, the Hokage said, smiling slightly. His teammates and Jounin Sensei have actually approached Jiraiya with a request to fix Gaara's seal. As Jiraiya's apprentice, you would be able to learn a great deal from the process. In addition, there's a possibility that your presence might have a calming effect on Gaara that could help things go smoothly. That said, the opposite could also be true since you want to help him. However, I'm sure you'd be willing to give it a try. Absolutely, Hokage-san, Kushu said, smiling widely. Time skip the tower within the forest of death. Alright kiddo, time to see how much good you'll do. I want you to inject a small amount of chakra into Gaara. If my theory is right, the tailed beast's chakra, and you will react with the chakra in Gaara and slow everything down, which will make replacing his seal that much easier. If not, we'll have to do it the hard way. Kushu nodded solemnly and approached Gaara. He had been forced to wait over a day while Jiraiya designed the replacement seal and planned out his approach to this process. Jiraiya had determined early on that Gaara's old seal would have to go entirely, which meant adding a temporary seal to act as a bridge between the old seal and the new one. If Jiraiya's theory was correct, however, the complexity of the bridge would be greatly reduced and the entire process sped up considerably. The seal would be keyed to the one-tailed beast's chakra and only pull that and leaving any other chakra present in Gaara's body undisturbed. He had initially hoped that Jiraiya would be using the Death God's seal or some variant thereof, but it seemed that Jiraiya was instead using one of his own design that he had been working on for years. Although there were some similarities from what he could see, Gaara himself had been kept unconscious since Jiraiya first brought him, and given that the kid had apparently never slept a moment in his entire life, Jiraiya and the Hokage had judged it a kindness to allow him to sleep now, and his team had agreed. They all hoped that the next time Gaara awoke, he would never have to deal with the screaming again. Jiraiya, Kushu and Gaara were the only ones in the room at the moment. Jiraiya had insisted that the fewer chakra presences in the room the better. For this, even Kushu would be ejected for the actual sealing if his presence did not calm Gaara's chakra. Jiraiya had already completed as much of the seal as he could, the writing covering most of Gaara's exposed skin and extending beyond his body onto sheets of sealing paper. The Only portions missing were dealing with the transfer of the tailed beast from one seal to another, and Jiraiya needed to see how Gaara's chakra would react before he filled in that section. Kushu laid a hand on Gaara's shoulder and extended his chakra Yuki mix into Gaara's chakra network, rapidly moving towards the seal. He could feel small bits of his brother's Yuki mixed in with Gaara's own chakra, but they were disjointed and didn't contain any part of Ryudo's consciousness. They were just remnants of expended energy, not active components of Ryudo's being. It looked like the seal supplied Gaara with power. That way it would certainly be effective in limiting Ryudo's influence. He finally reached the seal, and enter pain. He flung himself backwards with a scream of agony, hitting the wall behind him. With a loud crack he curled into a ball and shuddered for several seconds, the mere echo of what he had felt causing his body to react involuntarily. He felt Jiraiya shaking him and saying something, but the words didn't penetrate at first. To come on kid, talk to me, I'm alright, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. He channeled Yuki into his throat, quickly healing the torn muscles before he repeated his words, his voice clear. I'm alright, like hell you are. I've heard people scream like that before, and alright is the last word I would use to describe what made them do it. What the hell was that? I finally got to the seal and started to enter it. The seal did that to you, Jiraiya? Asked, shock evident in his tone. Yeah, and he has had to endure that every minute of every day since he was sealed, Kushu said angrily. I don't think he feels it directly, else he would have died long ago, Jiraiya replied, turning to look at Gaara. Still, even an echo of something like that would be pretty nasty. Kushu pushed himself to his feet and started to move back to Gaara, but Jiraiya grabbed his shoulder. Whoa, where do you think you're going to try again? Kushu said, simply say what now? Every minute we delay is another minute he has to endure that, even if it's just an echo. Kushu replied. He knew Jiraiya thought he was talking about Gaara, and he wasn't about to correct his mistaken assumption. He also wasn't about to let his brother endure something like that a single moment longer than necessary. Jiraiya stared into Naruto's face for several seconds, his eyes searching. He saw anger and a bit of pain, but overriding it all was grim determination. He nodded slowly, a small proud smile on his face. Alright kid, if you're sure, give it another shot. If that happens again though, I'm cutting this little project short. Torturing yourself isn't going to help him any. Kushu knelt beside Gaara again, once more laying his hand on his shoulder. He moved through the chakra network quickly, but paused outside the seal. If he just charged in again, the same thing would happen. He needed something to block the pain, or something to act as a buffer of sorts, something like a layer of chakra. He started pulling deeply on the body's pure chakra reserves, constructing a thick shell around his Yuki. He cautiously extended the tiniest bit of shielded Yuki into the seal. He could feel the shell eroding as the seal interacted with the chakra, and a small bit of pain leaked through, but it was nothing like the sheer agony he had experienced earlier. He paused, trying to estimate how much chakra it would take to maintain that shield, and how long he could hold it. After a few seconds he grinned. He had more than enough chakra for this. He took a steadying breath, made his body nod firmly at Jiraiya, then plunged into the seal. Jiraiya watched as Naruto's hand, then his entire body, began to radiate chakra. He knew the kid had a lot of chakra, but this was just ridiculous, and that was just the wasted chakra given off as visible emissions. He tensed when he saw Naruto grimace, but Minato's son grinned shortly thereafter, then turned and nodded to Jiraiya. The kid must be doing something differently, because he certainly wasn't screaming in agony this time. Jiraiya waited a few seconds to see if anything changed, but Naruto seemed entirely focused on whatever he was doing inside the seal. Jiraiya ran some quick checks on the activity within the seal. He grinned at the results he saw. He loved it when he was right. The overall movement within the seal had slowed dramatically, and the volatility of the chakra reactions had halved at least, and looked to be dropping further. Time to get to work. Kushu found himself in the middle of an endless desert, the sun shining directly overhead and beating down relentlessly. He was surprised that he actually felt the heat. His current form was composed of nearly pure Yuki, and did not normally experience such sensations. From his own experience with sealing, he assumed he was in this seal's version of the White Room, but it was clearly very different. Normally, he would be able to feel sensations outside the seal as clearly as he could inside. He could only vaguely feel the chakra shell slowly eroding, the sensation very distant and muted. He stretched out his senses, trying to find Ryudo in this endless expanse of sand. He felt something very quickly, two somethings in fact, and they were quite close. With a small exertion of will, he found himself next to a pulsating mass of Yuki and Gaara. Kushu could sense that Ryudo was slowly pulling himself together, and decided it would be best to let him recover uninterrupted. For the moment he turned his attention to Gaara. In the meantime, Gaara turned to look at him, his dull lifeless eyes taking in his vibrant red form and its fox-like appearance with little reaction. Are you stuck in here too? Gaara asked, his voice just barely tinged with curiosity. It's not so bad now that the screaming has stopped. Kushu considered the boy silently. He hadn't actually given much thought about what to do with the Jinchuriki. His thoughts had focused on helping Ryudo, on the clear and attainable goal of improving his seal. Could he kill Gaara, allow Ryudo to take over the body as he had taken over his own vessel? It was possible. Certainly he could stretch out his Yuki and destroy Gaara easily, though he was unsure that doing so would kill his soul or his mind. There would be no way for Ryudo to possibly pretend to be Gaara though, and it was doubtful that Ryudo could even deflect suspicion skillfully enough to avoid immediate discovery. Should they be willing to accept his amnesia and radical personality shift? No. Killing Gaara wouldn't help matters much, if at all. It seemed he would have to take the diplomatic approach again. He compressed his Yuki and mentally performed a henge, adopting the appearance of his vessel. Gaara's eyes widened in recognition. "You're the one who made the screaming stop. Did you do it again?" "Yes," Kushu replied, moving over to sit next to Gaara. "I made it stop again, and soon I'll be able to make it stop forever." Gaara slowly began to smile as he considered that thought. "No more screaming to make it stop forever, though I'm going to need your help." "Anything," Gaara replied immediately. Good, tell me, do you know what a Jinchuriki is?" Gaara's smile slipped and he nodded dully. "Yes, an abomination that doesn't deserve to live," he quoted. "No, Jinchuriki is a general term applied to a human being with a tailed beast sealed inside of them. For instance, you have the one-tailed beast sealed inside of you." "So I have been told," Gaara replied. Kushu stared at him for a few seconds before he pointed at the massive Yuki Gaara had been staring at earlier. Gaara blinked slowly before his eyes widened in understanding. "Surprising, in the stories it was hundreds of feet tall and made entirely of sand. He can look like that, I'm sure, but this is the true form of a tailed beast." Gaara nodded slowly before his eyes narrowed. "How do you know that? Are you a Jinchuriki too? Is that why you can make the screaming stop?" Jiraiya paused to examine his work, absent-mindedly wiping the sweat off his face. The new seal design he was using for Gaara was the most complex he had ever written. He had actually based the design off of the Death God seal, removing the sections which contained the unknown markings and replacing them with arrays of his own design. It probably wouldn't function nearly as well as Naruto's seal without those sections and the Death God's intervention, but it would certainly be a hell of a lot more effective and stable than Gaara's current seal, given the complexity of the design, making sure the beast's chakra entered the seal properly and that his bridge would only allow the chakra to flow one way. Despite the many connections between the two seals was quite difficult. It would have been much worse without Naruto's help. However, he checked on Naruto, but the kid still hadn't moved. He looked like he was in some sort of trance, but his chakra was still going strong and he hadn't so much as twitched since he began writing the bridge. Jiraiya turned back to his work, making sure that the sections he had already completed were written properly before he moved on. Kushu considered his response carefully before he answered, "Yes, I too have a tailed beast sealed inside of me." He said the truth. If he ever told Gaara at all would have to wait for another time. He needed to see how the new seal behaved and talk with Ryudo before he made any moves in that direction. Gaara nodded slowly. "I knew there were others, but I never thought I would meet one except perhaps in combat." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem normal." Kushu laughed sharply, the sound echoing throughout the desert. "I am anything but normal, I assure you. However, I have not had to deal with the problems you have had thanks to the nature of my seal." He laughed again. "Which is why I'm here to talk to you now," he continued without giving Gaara a chance to respond. "As we speak, a seal master, the sage Jiraiya, is crafting a new seal for you. Once it is complete, you will never have to deal with the screaming again." Gaara's face twisted into a smile and his eyes brightening before his expression suddenly turned wary. "Why are you doing this?" "2 reasons. Because your team asked, and because I asked." Gaara's eyes widened again, his expression slipping into disbelief. "They would do that? You would do that?" "Of course I would," Kushu said, speaking to more than just Gaara. "In every way that matters. You are my brother. I'm sure your team feels the same." Kushu's smile widened as he saw the ball of Yuki that comprised Ryudo's form beginning to calm. He wandered over to stand next to the ball, appearing merely to examine it curiously. He let his attention drift to his body for a moment and noted that Jiraiya was finishing up the bridge between the seals. The transfer would start soon. Knowing that Gaara was watching his every movement, he slowly and deliberately raised his hand before plunging it into the ball of Yuki. Underneath the surface, he pulled a portion of Ryudo's Yuki into himself and allowed a portion of his own to dissolve into the mass. In this manner he could gather Ryudo's memories and leave some of his own behind to help guide his brother in the days ahead. He closed his eyes, forcing back tears as a blissful feeling swept over him. Ino's description was very apt, as it did indeed feel like his very soul was singing. He could feel Ryudo's response even as they assimilated each other's memories. Tears began leaking from Kushu's eyes for a very different reason, as he vicariously experienced the last 100 years of Ryudo's life. It was mostly nothing but pain, endless, all-consuming pain. There were brief moments of peace. He had broken out of his seal quickly the first time, laying waste to everything around him as he struggled to reach the nearest portal back to Makai. He hadn't made it. The second moment of peace came soon after, and then the pain started. Kushu growled in disgust and anger as he reviewed the timeline in his head. Ryudo had been sealed in a ceremonial urn, the first time a human adult, the second the histories He had seen had not mentioned this third ceiling, but with his new knowledge it was obvious. What had happened? The ninja had noticed that the adult would not last long and chosen a new vessel along with a new seal. It wasn't even an act of desperation. They had plenty of time to create a proper seal. They had intentionally designed the seal to disrupt Ryudo's Yuki as much as possible. He stifled his budding rage and focused his attention back on Ryudo. He couldn't undo the century of torture much as he might want to, but he could make it easier to deal with. It seemed his studies in sealing would finally prove useful. He injected more Yuki into Ryudo's form, sweeping through his brother's form and pulling certain bits of Yuki into a ball. Those bits represented Ryudo's memories of the last 100 years and the pain and misery he had endured. He wished that he could remove them altogether, but that would likely prove impossible even for him for good, or they were a part of Ryudo. Once he had them gathered up, he imagined a locking seal surrounding the ball, and with a mental effort hardened it. Ryudo's Yuki swept over it for a long moment, but the seal gave off a strong sense of warning and foreboding, and the Yuki left it alone for the moment. The seal would fail eventually, but Ryudo would be able to deal with the memories in his own time. Regretfully, Kushu pulled away from the mass of Yuki and turned back to Gaara. The Suna Genin was staring at him with a curious expression. The new seal will activate soon, Kushu said, heading off Gaara's questions. I'm not entirely certain what will happen to you, but this chakra will probably leave here in some fashion. Don't fight it when that happens. Once everything is taken care of and you are free to move about, come find me again. There's a lot we need to talk about. Kushu watched from his body as Jiraiya activated the seal and Ryudo's Yuki streamed into the sky until it vanished beyond sight. Kushu made sure to use his human chakra as a buffer for as long as Ryudo was in the current seal, sparing him as much pain as possible. He turned to Gaara before leaving the seal himself. Oh, and one last thing, keep an open mind. You aren't the only one who has suffered with that cryptic message he left. Jiraiya grinned to himself as he watched the activity in the old seal stop completely. That had gone even more smoothly than he had dared hope. No doubt thanks to his newest student. The kid was finally coming out of his trance, looking a little winded, but none the worse for wear. That was an absolutely ridiculous amount of chakra he had. He dissolved the bridge and checked the new seal, making sure everything was working as it should. The beast's chakra was flowing smoothly and slowly leaking out into the boy's chakra network. Similar to how Naruto's seal worked, he'd have to recalibrate the rate of absorption once he had a good baseline for Gaara's tolerance for the stuff, but the relatively low rate he'd started off with seemed to be causing no problems that would beat Tsuer Shizen-chan's department. Though he turned his attention to the old seal and took great relish in dissolving the disgusting thing. He didn't care much one way or the other if the beast suffered, but the poor design and sloppy implementation of the seal was an affront to his sensibilities as a seal master. The new seal now, there was a work of art. He chuckled to himself as he pondered if there was anyone else in the entire world who could have accomplished what he and Minato's kid just did. Almost certainly not, and definitely not as quickly and as smoothly as they had. Damn, he was good. Ryudo shuddered into consciousness slowly, his Yuki moving in fits and starts as he once again became accustomed to a world without pain. The memories were distant. He could feel where Kushu had sealed them away and left that mess alone, but the after effects still lingered. He took in his surroundings, truly cognizant of his location and situation for the first time in a very long time. He was in a desert not dissimilar to where he had just been. If Kushu's memories were any guide, the heat wasn't nearly as oppressive though, and he was currently alone. Most importantly, there was no pain. He could feel his Yuki flowing into his container. Gaara Jin and human Jinchuriki. Kushu's memories told him and roughly sensed Gaara's state as he did so. It wasn't as clear as Kushu's memories indicated it should be, but then their situations were still very different. He considered attempting to overwhelm the seal again, but his own experience with the prior seals and the knowledge that this seal was much stronger stopped that plan in its tracks. Instead, he settled down and began to thoroughly review everything. Kushu had left him time to see what plans his brother had in store. Time skip outside the Konoha Academy. Troublesome Shikamaru muttered quietly, eyeing the large number of Chunin hopefuls scattered around the grounds of the academy. Just how many people are going to show up for this thing anyway? There were already over 60 teams gathered representing 4 of the 5 great ninja villages and a smattering of teams from the lesser villages such as Taki and Kusa. As far as Shikamaru could tell, every village he'd ever heard of except for Iwa had at least one team present, and Iwa's lack of participation was to be expected. Even should they attempt to send a team, it was unlikely the Hokage would allow them in the village. Kiba grinned eagerly. They can send as many as they like. We all know who's going to Win, he said confidently. Akamaru barked in agreement from his perch atop Kiba's head. Chuji shook his head. We can't say that for sure, he replied. Despite his words, he didn't appear particularly worried either, though he kept an appraising eye on the other teams. Ino just laughed softly. No, we're sure, she replied, jerking her thumb in Naruto's direction. She ignored Kiba's indignant reply as she turned to Sakura. So, what have you guys been up to? You missed the last 4 group training sessions. That's not like you. Sakura smiled mysteriously, sharing a knowing glance with Sasuke and Shino before she turned back to Ino. Oh, nothing much, she answered, her tone smug. Ino grinned. Oh, she said eagerly, you sure aren't acting like it's nothing. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain bet, would it? Sakura's smile grew wider, but she didn't reply. Naruto and Hinata were nearby chatting with Team Gayashi. Naruto-kun, Hinata-chan, I look forward to testing my flames of youth against you in the coming exams, Lee shouted. They both just nodded politely, knowing better than to do anything to encourage Lee verbally. Ten just shook her head sadly. He used to be such a nice quiet boy, she said mournfully, only partially in jest. He's right about one thing though, it'll be good to go against you guys and see where we stand. We've had to miss most of the training sessions thanks to our C-rank missions, but we've picked up a lot of real-world experience to compensate. Don't think things will go so easily for you, she said, smirking. Niji nodded in agreement. Gai-sensei's training is also not to be underestimated, he said simply. He and Ten repressed a small shudder even as Lee began to shout loudly about how amazing their sensei was. Right at 10 o'clock, several plumes of smoke erupted on top of the academy. Most of the ninja gathered around the academy immediately tensed and assumed defensive positions. Alright you maggots, listen up, a loud gravelly voice shouted. The smoke drifted away, revealing a large number of Konoha, Chunin and Jounin lining the roof of the academy. Ibiki Marino standing front and center. First off, you and Yui called out, pointing at 5 different genin. You fail, get your teams and leave. What came several angry cries from the genin or their teammates. Shikamaru's eyes widened slightly and he gave a muttered troublesome as he started whispering quietly to his team. Several other genin appeared to be having similar epiphanies and conversations. I said you fail, Ibiki said flatly. You were in the middle of foreign territory surrounded by unknown ninja, and you failed to react both to our arrival and to your fellow genin reaching for weapons and assuming stances. You might as well have just slit your own throat for all the good you do on a real mission. That's bullsh, one of the failed genin started to shout, but found his words dying in his throat as a wave of killing intent swept over him. Leave, Ibiki said again, his voice soft. I will not tell you again. Ibiki's threat finally seemed to penetrate as the failed teams turned and left, muttering angrily as they went, now that the trash is gone, we can get this little party started. First rule from this moment forward, until you leave the testing area and hand over proof that you passed the exam, consider yourself in the first phase of the Chunin exams. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you think will be evaluated and used to determine if you possibly might have what it takes to become a Chunin. Shikamaru cursed quietly as he whispered to his teammates again. The rest of the clan kids picked up on the reason for his annoyance or were clued in by their teammates very quickly and had their own whispered conversations, as did several other groups. Second rule, Ibiki continued, if one of the proctors you see before you tells you you have failed, you are to leave the testing area immediately. No arguing, no excuses. If you do not, you will be dealt with. Ibiki grinned toothfully and several of the other proctors looked eager. Third rule, if you leave the testing area without proof that you have passed, you are considered to have forfeited and will not advance to the second phase of the Chunin exams. Fourth rule, if you kill another genin or attack a proctor, you will fail immediately. Fifth rule, you have 3 hours after the start of the first phase to acquire proof that you have passed. If you do not to do so within the allotted time, you fail. Sixth rule, those who finish the first phase of the exam more quickly will have an advantage in the second phase, though I will not reveal the nature of that advantage at this time. Seventh rule, the proof that you have passed must be presented to me personally. Eighth rule, your entire team passes or fails the first phase of the exam. There is no individual advancement. If a single member of a team fails, then the whole team fails. I hope you've been listening, because the rules will not be repeated now. As for the nature of the exam itself, each team will be given a number which will serve as your designation throughout the rest of the Chunin exam. You will also receive a piece of paper with a coded message. The message contains vital information required to pass the first phase. The purpose of this exam is to gather a physical object and a piece of information. Once you have both, you must approach a proctor who will verify the authenticity of the object and the information, and issue a password. This password will serve as proof that you have passed the first part of the exam. Ibiki paused and surveyed the assembled genin. He smirked when he noticed a few teams sweating nervously, and his smirk grew when he saw a few other teams fidgeting impatiently. Alright, select one representative from your team to line up in front of the doors. Everyone else moved to the side. The genin milled about as they followed Ibiki's instructions, a few of them pushing and shoving as they struggled to reach the front of the line. Naruto Shikamaru, Sakura and Tenten were selected to represent their teams and all headed for the back of the line. After 30 minutes each team had a number and a code. Alright maggots, we will now depart for the testing area. Time skip. Training grounds. Through that gate lies training ground 5. The testing area consists of training grounds 1 through 10. Each training ground is surrounded by a fence and another higher fence surrounds the whole area, so no excuses about not knowing the limits of the testing area. The proctors are already scattered through the training grounds, and I will remain right here. If any of you maggots need extra help, I will be providing additional information in 1 hour. Whether it will help you or not remains to be seen, so weigh your options carefully, Ibiki said. He then moved over to a table and chair that had been set up earlier, and started flipping through the scrolls laid out on the table, seemingly ignoring the gathered genin. Several teams took off immediately into the training grounds, while others hunkered down to wait for the additional information. Team 7 along with the other rookie teams consulted briefly before exchanging nods. Naruto pulled out a scroll and a large cloud of smoke covered the group, drawing attention to them. As the smoke cleared, the genin who remained in the field could see food and water being passed around as the group settled in and began to chat amongst themselves. A few teams, who had been wavering in their decisions, decided to follow the Konoha team's lead, assuming that they had inside information that told them it would be better to wait. Ibiki smirked to himself. Time skip. Have you got the code yet, Ino? Naruto asked. Please, it's a shift cipher. I had this done before we left the academy. The code has 2 parts. The first is a shinobi must prepare before it is too late, and the second is 3 rivers meet 4 trees to yield 1 path. Hinata nodded slowly. Her Byakugan activated as she scanned around the area. There is a small stream nearby that heads in the direction of training ground 4. I think we should start there. Sounds good, Naruto said. I'd say that the shinobi saying is the information we need, and that the second part will lead us to the object. Ino grinned. You'd think they could make this a little harder for us. Time skip. You have failed the exam. Leave immediately, a proctor told the Kiri team. The Kiri genin all tensed, and one of them snapped. On what grounds? Because I said so, genin. You are to leave the training grounds immediately or you will be dealt with. The Kiri team tensed but slowly turned and began walking away. This only provided cover as they flashed through hand signs and launched jutsu using the water from the nearby stream. The torrent of water slammed into the proctor and dispelled the henge covering his form, revealing a Hoshi genin. His teammates leapt to his side as he pulled himself to his feet. How did you know? He asked, shocked that his ruse had failed. Figure it are on your own, dumbass, snapped one of the Kiri genin as they all flashed through another set of ninjutsu. A thick mist rolled into the clearing. Time skip. Here's the object, and the information is never attack where the enemy is strong, never defend where you are weak, Akusa genin said, handing over a wooden chit with the symbol for truth carved on it. The proctor examined the chit critically before finally nodding. Alright, the password is 4 of a kind, beats a full house. Now scram. The Kusa genin took off, heading back to training ground 5 and Ibiki. Once they were out of sight, the proctor turned to address the tree beside him. You got a proctor tagged Shino. The tree wavered and faded to reveal Shino and Sasuke, and the proctor's form blurred to reveal Sakura. Of course, Sakura-san. Then lead on, Sakura said with a grin. Time skip. Yash, it is a sign of our unending youthfulness that we would receive a clue that leads us to our own training ground. 1010 didn't even bother to reply, instead hopping towards another tree, heading for the landmark. Their code indicated the wooden chit with the symbol for youth. She discovered once they found it made her face twitch. However, one of the proctors clearly had a sense of humor that she did not appreciate. She was about to leave when she was interrupted by a Kumo team dropping out of the trees across the clearing. Lee watched them curiously, and Niji just shook his head in disappointment. Thanks for finding the object for us, one of the genin said, waving his kunai menacingly. Now just hand it over and we'll be on our way. 1010 sighed as she turned to face the other genin team. You guys do realize there's a reason we found this so quickly, don't you? The other genin scoffed. Yeah, this is your hometown. Why do you think we decided to follow you in the first place? Now hand it over. We may not be able to kill you, but we can still hurt you plenty, he added threateningly. 1010 just sighed and whipped a kunai towards him. The Kumo genin tensed but just watched in disbelief as the kunai sailed past him, not even close to hitting him. While your aim sucks, he said before he heard an ominous creaking behind him. He turned just in time to see a large log swing out of the tree and slam into him, throwing him across the clearing. More logs caught his teammates as they too were tossed about the clearing. He groaned as he looked up, his head swimming. You set traps that fast? He managed to get out before falling unconscious. More logs continued swinging throughout the clearing, moving at various speeds and angles. 1010 looked concerned for a moment. That didn't kill any of them, did it? Niji shook his head. No, they will be fine. Broken bones and concussions are the worst of their injuries. Lee frowned as he stroked his chin in confusion. I don't understand, why did he refer to Gai Sensei's youthful training course level 1 as a trap? 1010 just sighed and shook her head. She had long ago given up trying to Return Lee's point of view to something more in tune with reality. Time skip 2. Kankuro just shook his head as the Kiri Genin succumbed to the poison, falling unconscious. He knew his team was good, but to be able to take out an entire Genin team by himself that easily, he didn't think Suna's standards were that much higher. Come on, Gaara. Tamari said quietly, let's get this farce over with. Her teammate said nothing, just following behind Tamari at a sedate pace. Time skip 5. There should be a limit to how lazy you can be, you know, Kiba said quietly as his team exited the training ground and walked towards Ibiki. Shikamaru just shrugged. Why go through all that trouble when we only need the password? They walked up to Ibiki, who just stared at them impassively. The mountain pass is frozen, Shikamaru said. Ibiki scanned over the scroll in front of him before he nodded, striking through a line on the scroll with his brush. Team 73 passes, he called out loudly. More quietly he said, you're the 8th team to pass. Not bad. The picnic was a nice touch, by the way. Shikamaru just shrugged as he walked away, heading for the picnic Ibiki had mentioned. Sure enough, the figures of the clan kids could still be seen munching on snacks and chatting merrily. Shikamaru walked over to where his counterpart was lying on the grass and staring up at the sky. Plopping down beside the illusion, Kiba stared at them for a long moment, but other than the scent, couldn't actually tell the difference between them. That's just creepy, he said. He put his hands together in a ram seal and dispelled the illusion. The picnic wavered for a moment, then dispersed. He snickered to himself when he heard another team walk up to Ibiki and say the mountain pass is frozen. Ibiki made a show of looking over the scroll before announcing loudly, sorry, that password is no good. Team 54 fail. Shikamaru frowned to himself. Ibiki had announced their team number rather loudly too. He really hoped that didn't mean what he thought it did. He decided to pay closer attention to future announcements anyway. After Ibiki dealt with the team that had just failed, he stood up. Alright maggots, it's been an hour, time for the additional information, he shouted. The teams who had chosen to remain behind, 18 in total, looked up eagerly. The additional information is there are only 30 valid passwords and 8 of them have been used. Oh, and you have 58 minutes remaining before the first phase of the exam ends, that is. All smirking, he sat back down and resumed flipping through the scrolls spread out on the table. His smirk widened into a grin as he saw the teams who hadn't yet entered the training grounds pale and start swearing loudly as they panicked and rushed through the gate. He really loved his job. Sometimes. Time skip outside training ground 5. All 4 of the rookie teams had successfully passed the first phase at this point and were simply waiting for time to expire. A total of 21 teams had passed so far, with Konoha making a particularly strong showing with 10 teams passing the first phase already. Of course, they had also started with the most teams, so that was to be expected. Shikamaru had just revealed how his team had passed and was feeling slightly uncomfortable with the stares he was receiving at the moment. The tension was broken as Naruto began to chuckle lowly, his voice soon rising into full-blown laughter. You just eavesdropped on a proctor. Of course it's so you, Naruto said. Through his laughter, the other kids just shook their heads and relaxed, a bit of grudging admiration in their expressions. Anyway, I've got an inkling as to what the next test will involve, and it promises to be particularly troublesome, Shikamaru said lowly. Ibiki has been announcing the team numbers very loudly, and he mentioned at the beginning that the numbers we received would serve as our designations for the entire exam. They don't actually need those numbers to determine who passed or failed, though, and there's certainly no need to announce them so loudly normally. So what, he wants us to make note of the team numbers for some reason? Kiba asked. Sakura sucked in a breath with a low hiss. Crap, have you guys been tracking which team is which? She asked her team. Sasuke and Shino just shook their heads. I think we'd better start right now. Shikamaru nodded in agreement. Yeah, I think we're going to have to do something based on team numbers, and it's going to be a lot harder if we have no idea which team is which. I've been tracking them since we got here, but I don't know the numbers on the first 7 teams. He finished, quickly filling in the other genin on the team numbers. He knew a few more teams entered the clearing, bringing the total to 26. Ibiki stood up from his desk the moment the hour hit 1 o'clock. Alright maggots, time's up. Congratulations to all of those who managed to pass. In case any of you idiots haven't figured it out by now or somehow passed thanks to sheer dumb luck, I will explain the purpose of this exam. First off, a chunin needs to be able to remember information even if they only hear it once, and they need to be able to understand and apply that information as they proceed with their mission. I told you at the very beginning that the exam had already started, but some of you apparently didn't listen. I suppose I should be impressed that 3 teams managed to pass despite wasting an hour waiting for additional information. That was a trap, by the way. The information you got was basically useless, even if technically it did tell you more about the situation. I'd suggest you remember that for future reference. Waiting until you know everything is only useful if you still have time to act on it. A chunin is expected to know where to draw the line and act with what they have available, even if they know they could gather more information if they waited. As in this case, that information may end up just confirming that you waited too long, along with a Bit of simple code breaking, and any team that couldn't decipher that in the time allotted deserves to fail. We tested your tracking and navigation skills. Some of the foreign teams decided to follow a Konoha team around a sound strategy that worked out for some of you that had the proper level of stealth. Some other teams found out what happens when you mess with someone on their home turf. Once you actually had the object, you needed to guard it long enough to make it to a proctor. 7 teams had their item taken from them, and 6 teams handed their object and information over to another team posing as a proctor. One of those fake proctor teams actually handed off their own object and info to another fake proctor. Once again, they deserve to fail. Not all of your enemies are going to attack you face to face. One team actually got their password and failed to protect it. I told you at the very beginning that the exam wasn't over until you presented proof that you had passed. Letting an enemy get wind of vital information is just as bad or even worse than failing to obtain it yourself. Abiki paused for a moment, picking up a sheet of paper from the table. Alright, now for the second phase of the exams, your proctor should be along any. A large plume of smoke exploded in the clearing, and there were 4 rapid thunks of metal striking wood as the smoke cleared. The assembled genin could make out a banner proclaiming the sexy single Anko Mitarashi proctor for the second phase. Anko herself stood proudly, her hands on her hips as her trench coat flapped loosely in the breeze, revealing her typical mini skirt and skin-tight mesh bodysuit. Her violet hair was pulled into a spiky ponytail, her bangs almost completely covering her headband. Alright boys and girls, listen up. I'm Anko Mitarashi, your proctor for the second phase of the exams. You're done right, Abiki, Anko said, sauntering over to the scarred John, and she snatched the scroll out of his hand and looked it over quickly before rolling it up and tucking it into her trench coat. Abiki just waved her on. You can have the little maggots. I'm sick of looking at them. Great, Anko said, clapping her hands together loudly. Alright kiddos, follow me to the next testing area, she said, and immediately leapt into the tree behind her. Before tree hopping away quickly, the genin scrambled to their feet and followed her, leaving Abiki and the other proctors behind to deal with the genin still stuck in the training grounds. Time skip 30 minutes later. Anko finally stopped near a large fence with signs plastered all over it. The signs all said some variation of warning: in danger. This, boys and girls, will be the testing area for the next phase of the exams. Before we get any further, however, you've got a choice to make. You can call it quits right here or continue on with the exams, Anko said. Smirking silence permeated the clearing for a moment before a genin from Kumo hesitantly asked, why would we quit? Glad you asked, Anko replied. You would quit because from this point on the kitty gloves come off. You can and most likely will die if you go in there. It's known as the Forest of Death for a reason. Even without fighting the other teams, there are plenty of cute furry little animals in there that will rip your face off. She sighed dramatically. It's like a home away from home. This caused a ripple of laughter to spread among the genin until they realized that none of the teams from Konoha were laughing. My cute little slaves, you can call them proctors if you want, will be passing around waivers in the probable event of your gruesome demise. This will absolve Konoha of any responsibility. We did warn you after all. Yes, Konoha teams have to sign them too. It cuts down on the paperwork. Once you have signatures from your entire team, turn them back into a handy slave so we can keep moving. Anko waited impatiently, juggling a few kunai to pass the time. Once the other proctors signaled that all the waivers had been collected, she resumed speaking. Great, now for the rules. First rule: you have 3 days from the moment the second phase begins to deliver all required items to the tower in the middle of the forest in order to pass. Wait 3 days? We don't have any packs or tents with us, cried out the sole remaining Hoshi team. Not my problem, shithead. You hear anyone else complaining? They either have the equipment on them somehow or are prepared to cope as any chunin should. Moving on. Second rule: you may not leave the forest of death for any reason. Once the second phase begins, doing so will cause you to fail the exams. Third rule: you may not enter the tower without first presenting the required items. Doing so will cause you to fail the exams. Fourth rule: attacking an exam proctor will cause you to fail. Fifth rule: your entire team must be present and alive in order to pass. If a single member of your team dies or fails, the entire team fails. Now for the particulars: each team will be issued a marker with their team number written on it. In order to pass, your team must present its own marker in addition to 2 other specific team markers to a proctor at the tower. If you do not have your team's marker or fail to acquire the other team's markers, you will not be able to continue. That's the easy part, Anko said, grinning maliciously. We will not be announcing team numbers from this point on, so I really hope you were paying attention earlier, otherwise your job is going to be a lot harder. She paused to let that sink in and laughed in delight at the panicked looks on some of the team's faces. Getting her laughter back under control, she continued her explanation. We will call the teams forward in the order that they passed the first phase of the exam. Once you have all of your information, you will be able to choose one of the following options: which team numbers you must acquire, which team number must acquire your number, which gate you start from, which gate a specific team starts from, where you can find out which Team corresponds to a single number. Any decisions made earlier in the process preempt those made later, so if two teams are already targeting Team 1, no one else will be able to claim them later, and so on. Once you have made your choice, you will move directly to your gate and wait for the signal to start the exam. Oh, and just because we know someone will try it, 6th rule, you can't pick your own team number as a target in any fashion, she added, smirking at Shikamaru. He just grumbled under his breath while his teammates snickered. Now then, you, she said, pointing to a team from Kumo, managed to pass first, so step into our handy tent and we can get this started. 8th place, Anko told Shikamaru. Kiba and Chuji, so what'll it be? Kiba and Chuji looked at Shikamaru, who just sighed. What is our information? Without making any choices, Anko smirked. Finally someone who pays attention. As it stands, you will be targeting teams 9 and 47, and starting from gate 24. Who is targeting our team? He asked. Nope, that isn't included unless you want to pick out which team it will be, Shikamaru grumbled softly as he considered his options. Which gate is team 47 starting from? Also not included. TCH, fine, team 47 has to target our team. Radio, Anko said. Record it, slave, she said, slapping one of the Chunin on the back playfully. The Chunin just grumbled good-naturedly as he made the adjustments to the scrolls. Chuji took the chit and hid it on his person before they left the tent. Make sure you have the scent on those two teams. Kiba, those are our targets, Shikamaru said discreetly, motioning to an AIM team and a Kiri team. Got it, Kiba said quietly. Akamaru yipped in agreement. 9th place, Anko said as Tamari and her team entered the tent. What'll it be? What do we have now? Asked Tamari. You are currently targeting team 27 and team 70 and will be starting from gate 3. Tamari grimaced. Those were both Konoha teams and she really didn't want to tempt fate at the moment. After reviewing her options for a moment, she decided to pick two Suna teams to target. They would surrender immediately once they realized Gaara was targeting them, or it looked like Gaara was targeting them anyway. Kankuro was skilled enough with his puppet and knew Gaara well enough to mimic anything short of his sand control. Gaara himself would be waiting inside the tower for them, hopefully still resting peacefully, as he caught up on a lifetime's worth of sleep. Wheel target teams 22 and 43. Team 22 is already taken. Fine, 43 and 46. Radio, 11th place, Anko said as Naruto, Ino and Hinata entered the tent. What'll it be? Information prompted Naruto. Now it's just getting boring, Anko complained. As it stands, you will be targeting teams 57 and 61 and will start from gate 8. The 3 genin consulted briefly. Change our targets to team 2 and team 60 is already taken. 2 and 50 then done. 12th place, Anko said as Niji, Lee and Tenten entered the tent. What'll it be? Information asked Niji. No fun at all with you guys, Anko muttered. You current targets are team 14 and team 71. You will start from gate 16. The genin cursed quietly. 71 was Naruto's team. They didn't want to target their friends in any case, but they really didn't want to target his team in particular. They had hoped to use their option to gain an advantage, not get rid of a disadvantage. They talked it over. Will target teams 16 and 57, they finally said. Got it. 14th place, Anko grumbled as Sakura, Sasuke and Shino walked into the tent. What'll it be? In for Kami. I hate you guys, no fun at all. You are currently targeting teams 9 and 61 and will start from gate 1. Sakura turned to her teammates. 9 is the team that finished just before we did. Do we want to change our targets? I suspect we will have some difficulty acquiring the targets we desire at this point. It would be logical for the earlier teams to target those teams that finished last, as they would be the weakest. Shino reasoned. Sasuke shrugged. It's not any teams in our group, so does it matter? Sakura grumbled under her breath, then turned to Anko. Team 61 has to target us. Anko grinned maliciously as she noted the other team that had to target team 9. That would make things interesting. Radio, time skip. Forest of Death, gate 8. A loud bang echoed in the distance, and the proctor who had escorted them to their entrance gate channeled chakra into the locking seal. The gate swung open, creaking ominously. Naruto snickered. Nice touch on the sound seal there. Scared the hell out of me the first time I heard it, the Chunin confessed. Anyway, get a move on. The second phase has started. Naruto lead the team into the forest, moving rapidly for a couple of minutes and covering roughly half a kilometer of the heavily forested terrain before they stopped in a convenient clearing. Hinata already had her Byakugan activated, scanning for any approaching teams as well as trying to locate their targets. There are 2 teams in the area, both currently moving away from us. One of them is team 2. Naruto grinned widely. Perfect, let's go say hello to our new friends. Time skip. The genin team from Kiri paused to catch their breath. They weren't used to this terrain, and all the tree hopping they had to do in order to move at something resembling a decent speed was already wearing on them. They were Hoping to track down the Odo team first before they had to deal with their fellow Kiri team as their second target, Shuichi quickly drew his sword when a blonde Konoha genin stepped out from behind a tree, his two teammates, both female, following close behind him. "Hey guys," the blonde said, waving happily. "How's everything going?" Shuichi kept a wary eye on them, not letting his guard down. Such an obvious approach had to be a prelude to a trap. He saw Kasumi stiffen slightly for a moment out of the corner of his eye, but she quickly relaxed. "What do you want, idiot?" he snapped at the blonde. "Now that's not a very nice thing to say," the other genin replied, frowning. His eyes suddenly widened and his hand thrust out, pointing somewhere behind Shuichi. "Look out, there's something behind you." "Really? That's the best you've..." He never got to finish his sentence as Kasumi's scabbard slammed into the back of his head, knocking him out. Naruto sighed sadly. "I tried to tell you." Kasumi just shook her head even as she tied up her teammates and removed all of her equipment pouches. "You are way too good at acting like an idiot, Naruto. Is there something we should know?" "Ah, here's the marker. Laugh it up, Ino, laugh it up." He looked up into the branches overhead. "Anything headed our way?" Hinata's voice drifted down. "Not yet, no leads on our other target at the moment." "Alright, you guys head north and keep looking. I'll catch up to you in a bit. I need to take care of something here," he said, dispelling the two Bunshin beside him and advancing on the unconscious Kiri team. As soon as Ino ended the mind transfer, he had the last genin unconscious and swiftly tied up. He exchanged a significant look with Ino as she entered the clearing, and she nodded quickly, understanding his message. "Are you sure?" Hinata asked quietly as she dropped into the clearing. "It's fine, Hinata," Ino said, leading her away. "We'll be able to cover more ground this way. Just don't take too long," she told Naruto. He waved them off and they soon left. He waited a few minutes until he was certain Hinata's Byakugan was out of range, then moved to the first Kiri genin, slapping him awake. Shuichi sputtered for a moment before he glared at Naruto. "What the hell do you want, Konoha nin? You've got our marker already, I'm sure, but you can still be useful to me. You see, I've got so many things I've wanted to try out, but experimenting on allies is considered bad form. How fortunate that we're alone, that you aren't from Konoha or one of our allies, and that you sign that handy little waiver." Shuichi's face slowly grew pale, but he tried to laugh it off. Haha, very funny. "You can untie us now. Before we get started, there's one question I'd like to ask of you," he said, inhaling deeply. Even this close, with time to focus on the scent, he couldn't detect any trace of his sister, who was supposedly bound in Kiri. "What happened to your village's Jinchuriki?" The genin looked genuinely confused at the question. "What's a Jinchuriki?" Naruto just shook his head and held up his finger, extending a bit of pure yuki from the tip. "Ah, well, I guess you can't be expected to know something like that. Now I need you to be honest. Does this hurt?" Judging by the screams, it did. Time skip. Sakura sighed as she followed Shino through the forest. He had only been able to tag one of their targets, and it seemed that the Konoha team he had tagged had started far enough away that none of his bugs could detect them at the moment. They were reduced to moving towards the tower in the hopes of finding either of the teams they needed to pass. They had greatly reduced their pace from the initial dash into the forest, wary of running into other teams or trapped. Shino's bugs were very useful for tracking chakra, but mundane traps were rather harder for them to detect. Sasuke's Sharingan was useful there, but he couldn't afford to keep it active for too long lest he burn through all his chakra. Shino's hand suddenly came up in warning, and the group halted, assuming defensive stances as they scanned the forest around them. The massive trees within the forest of death towered above them, the trunks easily 100 feet in diameter. They couldn't see anything yet, but they trusted Shino's scouting abilities and knew someone or something was nearby. After a tense moment of silence, Asuna Genin stepped out from behind a tree, a war fan held defensively in front of her. "You aren't our target," she called out warily. "No need to fight." Sakura exchanged quick glances with her team, mouthing the word 30. Sasuke just shrugged and relaxed slightly, though he continued to scan their surroundings in case it was a trick. Shino inclined his head slightly, indicating his own acceptance. "You aren't ours either," Sakura called out. "If you head on your way, we won't attack you." The Suna Genin nodded slowly and began moving away, keeping her distance as she circumvented the Konoha team. A minute later, she jumped away. Neither Sakura or Sasuke detected her teammates at any point, which worried them slightly. "There's something odd about that team," Shino said quietly once they were alone. "My Kakaichi reported 3 people moving about, but only detected 2 chakra signatures." "What does that mean?" "The third person can completely suppress their chakra," Sasuke asked. "Completely suppressing chakra is impossible," Shino replied firmly. "Kakaichu can detect and distinguish even civilian levels of chakra. One of the hidden genin had chakra attached to the third, in some manner I have never seen before." Sakura thought it over for a moment. "It was a Suna team, so a puppet perhaps." Shino inclined his head towards Sakura. "That would explain it. Yes, that also means their third teammate is not within range of my Kakaichu or has found a way to avoid them. I do not like that." "Well, let's assume he was out of range for the moment, but keep an eye on them anyway." They finished just after Shika's team did so. "They're probably one of the stronger teams in the exam." The genin We saw looked what 15-16 Sasuke nodded about. That yeah, definitely a veteran team. Well, we can worry about them if they pass. We still need to find teams 9 and 61. Time skip. What's the plan? Shika Akamaru has team 9 sent. There may be 10 minutes ahead of us. Shikamaru fell into a crouch, resting on his heels. His hands came up in front of him, the thumbs and fingers connecting to form a circle. Kiba and Chuji both recognized this as Shika's thinking pose, and fell silent to wait, keeping a watch on their surroundings as they did so. A minute later, Shikamaru dropped his hands and sighed. We need to hit them while we can. Another team is targeting them and we have no idea how close they could be or where they'll go after they attack. Securing the marker now is our best option. Ideally we could wait until one or both teams were tired, but until we have at least one marker secured we need to be aggressive. Fine by me, Kiba said. Smirking, Chuji just nodded, ready to support whatever decision Shikamaru made. Alright, here's the plan. We'll follow them until they begin to make camp and strike. Before they have a chance to secure the area, I'll lead with a shadow possession jutsu. With luck I'll be able to hit all of them and we'll be done. Chuji will cover me while Kiba and Akamaru close in from the opposite side. Will make adjustments as needed just before we attack. 2 hours later, the Kiri team they were tracking finally stopped and began pulling off their pack. Shikamaru pointed out the location he would attack from and where he wanted Kiba to launch his attack from. Then the group split up to move into position before they reached their designated spots. However, one of the Kiri genin began running through hand signs. Shikamaru cursed and shouted, "Plan C." Kiba immediately broke from cover and charged the Kiri genin, tossing kunai as he went. He had hoped to disrupt the jutsu, but another genin intercepted his kunai, easily slapping them out of the air with a sword. The genin smirked and charged forward, closing in with Kiba. Damn it. Kiba growled softly as he jumped back. He hated fighting weapon users. 10-10 always gave him trouble in their training sessions, even when he had Akamaru backing him up. Shikamaru eyed the Kiri genin for a moment before he stepped back into the shadows, seamlessly creating a bunshin in his place. Dragon horse sweeps left, he muttered under his breath. Chuji nodded and rumbled into the clearing, moving far slower than he was capable of, and making sure to draw attention. Shikamaru's bunshin followed behind, brandishing kunai and looking vaguely threatening. Shikamaru himself began circling the clearing quietly. The Kiri genin finally completed his jutsu and slammed his hand onto the ground, calling out, "Water release." Water geyser. The ground rumbled for a brief moment before a stream of water burst from the ground and shot upwards, reaching 50 feet high before it began to fall back to the ground. The third genin on the team, the sole female, was already running through her own hand signs. Chuji put on a sudden burst of speed, catching the third genin off guard as his fist slammed into her stomach, launching her backwards to slam into a tree at the edge of a clearing. The unfortunate genin didn't have time to recover or even fall to the ground before Chuji was on her again, backhanding her with his left arm and tossing her back towards the middle of the clearing. He felt a little bad about doing that to a girl, but his ninja training, and more importantly years of getting thrashed by Ino and Hinata and spars, dulled that guilt considerably. He followed after his target, leaving the first Kiri genin separated from his teammates behind him. Kiba and Akamaru were currently darting back and forth, harassing their sword-wielding opponent. Neither had managed to land a blow, but neither had taken a blow either. Shikamaru's bunshin was closing with the first Kiri genin, but the chakra-laced water was disrupting the bunshin's form, revealing its illusory nature. The first Kiri genin cursed before running through a short string of hand signs and calling out, "Water release." Water spear. He pulled back his right hand and a stream of water detached from the geyser. Following his hand's movement, he started to thrust his hand forward towards Chuji's back, but suddenly jerked to the side as he did so, the lance impacting a tree instead of his intended target. Shadow possession success. Shikamaru called out, alerting his teammates to the changing situation. Chuji and Kiba both grinned as they heard Shikamaru's voice. The first genin began walking towards the ongoing battle between Kiba and the sword-wielding genin, while Chuji moved to cover his own opponent, who was currently attempting to pull herself off the ground with limited success. A kunai held to her throat put a stop to her efforts. It would be a good idea to surrender at this point, Shikamaru said lazily as he entered the clearing. He stopped walking as the shadow that was currently connected to the first genin forked and connected to Chuji's downed opponent. Once Chuji saw that Shikamaru had his opponent captured, he moved to reinforce Kiba. The remaining Kiri genin settled into a defensive stance as he took in the situation. He sighed and lowered his sword slightly. "Fine, I surrender." "Good, now drop your sword and any other weapons you have and turn over your marker." The genin slowly complied, keeping a wary eye on the Konoha ninja. Kiba and Chuji kept their distance, but didn't relax from their stances once the genin had dropped all of his pouches. He pointed to the third gen and she has the marker. Chuji moved back over to her and searched through her pouches, finally pulling out the wooden marker with the number 9 written on it. He checked it over for any illusions or traps, but eventually nodded. Got it. He told his team, alright, here's the deal. Shikamaru said, we're going to take most of your equipment, but you can keep your sword for self-defense. I would suggest leaving the forest now, but that's your call. If you try to follow us, or if we run across you again, we'll have to take more permanent measures. Thanks. The Kiri Genin replied sarcastically. He watched sullenly as the Konoha team tied up his 2 teammates, gathered up all of their ninja tools and food supplies, and took off. Fucking treehuggers, growled the first Genin once they had left. We need to get our marker back, he said. Not happening, replied the third Genin with a wince. They could have killed us easily, and I'm not sure they were even trying that hard. The fat one hit harder than our sensei does during spars. Yeah, we're done, we need to get out of here, added the second Genin. Fine, damn it, time skip. Day 1 of the second phase Sarutobi residence. The Hokage examined the many files spread out on his desk, thinking deeply. His mind had constantly rehashed the conversation with the Toad's contract keeper, trying to analyze the answers and evasions they had received for the hidden truth. He also recalled Jiraiya's report concerning what Gamabunna had told him about the events of the ceiling. Then too, the Toad chief had stumbled over certain answers, and Jiraiya, skilled spymaster that he was, had picked up on their reticence easily, even if he couldn't explain it. The Toads and the other summons most likely knew something about the tailed beasts that they weren't saying the way the Toad had phrased his responses. The one known as Naruto Uzumaki, essentially correct, also pulled at his mind. He hadn't given it a great deal of thought at the time, but he found his mind drifting to those words more and more, and a certain nagging feeling had begun to claw at him. He pulled out the report on Itachi's desertion and attempted assassination of Naruto. Never trust your eyes, he'd said. He had been reviewing Naruto's file. At the time had been for several days. According to the archive logs, they never had figured out what he'd been referring to. Sarutobi reviewed the order of events in his head. Itachi reads the file, suffers some sort of seizure or fit, says those words to the 2 people present in the room, somehow lures Naruto from within the Yamanaka household into the forest of death, where he then attempts to kill him and flees Konoha. They had come up with many theories to explain Itachi's actions: jealousy, insanity, treachery, but none of them seemed to fit, and none explained his last words or the lack of any other signs prior to the event. Sighing, he turned his attention to Naruto's medical file. Shizen-chan had briefed him on the changes to Naruto's eyes and her speculation that these changes could continue perhaps indefinitely as the concentration of the tailed beast's chakra continued to grow within his body. She reiterated that he was suffering no ill effects from the process and that the changes were at worst cosmetic and potentially beneficial. She had been unable to explain the discrepancy in the growth pattern. However, she had initially theorized that the concentration had reached maximum saturation in his eyes and would do so in the rest of his body at some point. Even based on this additional information, she couldn't explain why or how the concentration had stopped increasing before and resumed now. Sarutobi rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It was certainly an odd coincidence that the increase would stop just shy of triggering visible changes. Shizen's theory about the eventual form of his eyes following the same path as the marks on his cheeks and mimicking the traits of the 9-tailed beast was a little disconcerting, even as she emphasized that this change was strictly due to the increase in chakra levels within his body and in no way indicated the tailed beast's influence. Sarutobi froze, a cold feeling settling deep into his gut. His hand slowly reached out and pulled out a report. Inoichi, shortly after the Kumo incident, detailing the differences in Naruto's reactions to the attempted assassination and the Kumo ninja's attack, specifically how he found the fact that Naruto did not call upon the tailed beast's chakra encouraging, and how he felt this reflected the benefits of Naruto's new situation already. Sarutobi pulled out another report, this one from a Hyuga ANBU member tasked with studying Naruto's chakra after the sudden spike in his chakra control. The ANBU had reported that the 2 different chakras within his body began merging in preparation for a jutsu, the process seemingly instinctual. Another report, this one from Shizen: Naruto's medical studies were progressing rapidly, his chakra control nearly perfect and his knowledge steadily growing. He did not seem bothered at all by the less pleasant aspects of surgery. He also expressed an interest in optimizing bodily functions in addition to repairing damage, and had submitted a short thesis on a potential method of increasing muscle density for Shizen's review. Another report, this one from Inoichi: Naruto continues to have difficulty sleeping and will often enter the library late at night when he finds himself unable to sleep. However, he seems to suffer no ill effects from this lack of rest. A note on the report referenced an examination performed by Shizen, who determined that the rapid healing Naruto had also greatly reduced his need for sleep. Sarutobi pulled out another report, this one containing Inoichi's original theory about Naruto's condition. I think Naruto was aware and Cognizant as early as 6 months old, he had said the cold feeling in his gut hardened into fear as he began to wonder if it might not have been even earlier than that time skip day 1 of the second phase, the Forest of Death. Neji watched their surroundings warily as Tenten finished setting up the last of the traps. Lee would be taking second watch and so had already fallen asleep in his tent. Tenten made her way to the center of the clearing and unsealed her tent, quickly setting it up with practiced ease. That was rather lucky, wasn't it? She asked idly as she worked him. Neji replied absently, both our targets starting from gates near ours. I thought we'd have a harder time of it since we had to pick new targets, but it worked out very well in the end. Do not relax your guard yet, we still have to make it to the tower. You know what I meant. Tenten snapped. My apologies. Yes, it was lucky. Sorry, Tenten said quietly after a moment. I'm just worried about the other teams. I know they have skills. We've trained with them after all, but they're still rookies. Judging from the caliber of opponents we have seen so far, I don't think they will have any difficulty, Neji replied confidently. Tenten snorted softly. You've got a point there. She looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook her head. Good night, Neji, she said, then crawled into her tent. Good night, Tenten, Neji replied, still scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. He would activate his Byakugan for a few moments, then deactivate it again, trying to conserve chakra for the rest of the night's sleep. Well, he muttered quietly, his eyes lingering on Tenten's tent for a moment.